You're a physical therapist, but you say the human spine is the product of a good designer, not evolution. Why is that?
Yeah, I think that we're all used to seeing things designed all around us. When we see a lot of interrelated aspects of a complex thing like an electric or hybrid vehicle, we automatically know, well, that had to have come into being through a designer. When you look at this interrelated connectiveness of this spine with the disc, the ligaments, the nervous system, the blood vessels and the muscles, and I look at the spine, I just marvel at the complexity and the beauty of it. I see evidence that there had to have been an intelligent designer behind all of this.
If our spine is so well designed, why do so many people suffer with back pain?
Well,
Jonathan Clerke, you were a physiotherapist for over 30 years and studied parasitic diseases. You say that the spine did not evolve. Why is that?
well, I could talk about that for hours, but we haven't got hours, unfortunately. But in a nutshell, I don't see any evidence for it having evolved. Evolution actually means that nothing by itself became something, non-living matter, and then by itself that was meant to then become a life form, a single cell perhaps, and then from that life form came parrots and parasitologists and physiotherapists and panda bears. I don't see any evidence for all that progression. And when I look at the spine, I just marvel at the complexity and the beauty of it, and so I really don't see any indication that this is something that could possibly have formed by itself through random mutations over a long period of time.
So before we jump into it, just to be clear, is a physiotherapist in the UK and Australia the same as a physiotherapist in America?
Well, I'm not at all biased when it comes to this. Australian physiotherapists are obviously the best in the world and always have been. But no, more seriously, our colleagues in the UK and the US, they're a little bit different. Some of it relates to access to patients. So physiotherapists have always enjoyed direct access. So you can walk in off the street and we'll diagnose you. We'll look after you from go to woe. In America, they don't always have that privilege. And when they do, sometimes they're a bit more constrained by their insurers and their health systems than what we are as to what to do and when to do it and how to proceed. Also, some physios learn to inject particular substances into joints, so they do extra training to do that. Some physios use dry needles or acupuncture needles to affect change in a muscle, just like you might use a heat pack or a cold pack or your hands to affect change in a muscle.
Yeah, and so being a physio, do you just work with muscles? Is it as straightforward as that?
Yeah, it's surprising how often I hear that comment. I don't know where it arose, but no, we don't just work with muscles. We work with the whole neuromusculoskeletal system, so nerves, muscles and joints. Some physios even work on incontinence. Some physios actually work on neonatal lungs. But in general, most of us, we work on the neuromusculoskeletal system. And it's very complex. Muscles aren't just simple.
More than just a glorified sports stretcher then?
Yeah, more than what you eat at night when you have a good rump steak. So yeah, this here is a spine. I brought it in. It's plastic, in case anyone's worried. It's been quite a few decades since people have used real ones, and that's a good thing. And so what we're looking at here is this would be the head end. This is where your pelvis is, what you and I are sitting on at the moment. And this is the back of the spine. So if you're a skinny person and you're at the beach, you would see all these knobbly bits on a person's back. And we call these the spinous processes. And you can see sometimes they start off with a little bifid or two-pronged sort of a end, and sometimes they have quite an angle, and sometimes they're more rectangular. So they shape from the top to the bottom.
They're quite a bit thinner than I expected them to be.
Yeah, depending on whether you're a power lifter or a ballerina, will depend on the size. So when muscles pull on bones, bones respond by becoming stronger. So every single little bump you see on this spine will have muscles attached to it, every single little bump. So you might not appreciate it, but here is where we got our head end up here. And this is what we call the lumbar spine. This is the thoracic spine where your ribs come from, and this is your neck. If we go down here, because everything's bigger, you can see that this here is a joint. And that joint has a little bump there. Even that little bump has a name.
Okay.
Every little bump has a name because that's where muscles typically come from. And the bumps are there for a purpose. And the muscles on the back, just the back alone, let alone the muscles around your jaws, which physios work on, or the muscles around your ankles, which physios work on, apart from the joints, there's lots of muscles on the back. There's actually 17 pairs of what we call true or deep or intrinsic muscles, let alone all the other muscles on the back. 17 pairs of them.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah, it's quite a lot. So they're in layers. So there's a superficial layer. So with the superficial layer, there's a splenius muscle. We call it splenius cervicus and splenius capitis, so two muscles. One tips the head in relation to the neck and one tips the neck. So you've got your superficial muscle we talked about in the neck, the splenius muscles. Then you've got a group of muscles that are the next layer down called your rectus spinae.
Okay.
And there's three big muscle groups in that. So there's not just three muscles that make up the rectus spinae. Each muscle is in its own zones, if you like, zones to do with being in the upper part or the lower part. And then there's a deeper set of muscles yet again. Some people might have heard these names like the multifidus, and the rotators.
What are these?
These are very, very deep muscles that you might hear about if you go to a physiotherapist, because we think sometimes these deep muscles are the ones that cause people's problems when they work asymmetrically.
And are they?
It's not always easy to answer that question.
Okay.
Some people have great asymmetry between the multifidus on one side and the multifidus on the other. So it'd be like having a big bicep on one arm and a small bicep on the other. And some people don't seem to have any troubles.
Yeah.
But other people, when they come into the clinic, if you address that asymmetry, if you help them correct the size imbalance or the strength imbalance, you seem to be able to improve their pain condition. So maybe for some people it's a very big factor in their pain, but I don't think it's a big factor for everybody, because obviously some people have asymmetries without pain. And then there's an even deeper layer again. These are things called, muscles called the levatores and the interspinalis, and then the transversali muscles. So you can appreciate that that's a lot of layers of muscles.
It's a lot of layers and quite a lot of complexity. Could it have evolved by itself?
Well, consider some of the intricacies of what that statement would mean. So like with the multifidus muscle, it'd be wrong to think that it's just going from one bump or one layer to another layer as just a smooth sheet. Just that one muscle has 4 layers. And the third layer of muscle fibres actually connect to the second layer of muscle fibres and that muscle's tendons. So that's a lot of interconnectivity. And we were talking before about how if there's a lack of symmetry, sometimes that seems to cause pain. So you can imagine if there's a lack of interrelated and coordinated activity, it's going to be the same sort of outcome. And yet there's not. It's a complex design. And then muscles, of course, don't have brains. They don't, well, your heart's got like a mini brain. It'll keep pumping away, providing everything else is equal. But for all other skeletal muscles, all their input has to come from your brain. You think about scratching your ear or pulling on your ear, so you think it and then you make it happen. So you will it in your mind, and then nerves have to carry those messages to the relevant muscles, and they have to do that in a coordinated fashion, so you actually do hit your ear instead of hitting your chin. So how do those nerves speak to muscles? And that's what's a fascinating part. So a nerve's got to come down and activate the muscle. And we talk about when a nerve meets a muscle, in terms of it being a fine end branch, we talk about the neuromuscular junction. And what's interesting is there's not one nerve speaking to one muscle fibre.
Okay.
That would be impossible because, for instance, in your gastrocnemius, your big calf muscle, there's 1,100,000 muscle fibres.
Wow.
So you don't want to have 1,100,000 nerve fibres trying to tell your gastrocnemius muscle what to do.
Oh, that's a big cable.
That's a big cable, yes, excellent. And more complicated than an optic fibre cable. There's nutrients that shunt up and down for a start, apart from the electrical signal that travels along. And it travels very fast, by the way. I don't know what it is. Yes, I do. It's about 280 miles per hour, which is about 435 kilometres an hour, how fast the signals can travel in some nerves in your body. I'm not saying all nerves by any means. So the signals can travel very fast. So one nerve's coming along, it branches and it sends this little fibre to a group of muscles. And we call that group of muscles that one nerve fibre talks to the motor unit. It's so if like a car is a unit of wheels and mechanical pistons, so equally a motor unit is a combination of one branch of a nerve fibre speaking to a group of muscle cells. And this is what's fascinating, how well it's designed. So some muscles, like the ones that work in your hand, some of those one nerve speak to just 42 muscle fibres only. But other muscles like your scleus, it's another big calf muscle.
Yeah.
It's more used to help you stand straight rather than help you run away from a snake. It's got one nerve branch speaking to 180 muscle fibres on average.
Well, that's a lot more than 40.
Yeah. And the gastrocnemius muscle, that big one that helps you run away from things, that has one nerve fibre speaking to up to 2,000 muscle cells.
Wow.
And then you got to think, well, why is it designed that way? Well, think about it. If you do have to run away from a snake, you want to have explosive power. You want to have all your muscle fibres in your leg firing off as quickly as possible with as least effort. And so the brain, when it sends a signal down just one nerve fibre, it's getting a lot of bang for its buck because 2,000 muscles are going to suddenly respond. So if there's 10 nerve fibres speaking to some of your muscles in your gastrocnemius, then that's up to 20,000 muscle fibres that are all helping you propel yourself away from the snake.
Brilliant.
It's brilliant when you want it to be in that scenario. But imagine that you're just standing. You've got to stand for an hour while you're listening to a speech or whatever. And your scleus, your calf muscle, is the one that's stopping you from falling forward. So it's working just about all the time when you think you're standing still. And in this case, it doesn't need explosive muscle power, does it? It's just looking at doing fine movements to keep your centre of gravity where it should be. And you don't need many muscle fibres to do that. So instead of wasting a lot of energy by every time a signal going down the nerves activating 2,000 muscle fibres, one signal operates only 180 muscle fibres, because otherwise it'd be a waste of energy, wouldn't it?
Yeah, of course it would.
And then if you think about your hand, when one motor unit is only 42 muscle fibres in size, that means you can do very fine and gentle movements, which is great for surgeons and people who sew and people who paint. So when you start to appreciate that complexity of the nervous system and the muscle system being integrated, you can see how unreasonable it seems that just one mutation causing one little change in a muscle or one little bit of muscle tissue to grow where it shouldn't be can actually do something worthwhile. And as you know, if a mutation does create some extra structure in your body, if it's not useful, then according to the theory of evolution, sooner or later it will disappear out of the population.
We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but first, I'd like to thank you for watching these videos. And if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe and ring that notification bell, as it helps us create more content like this. Let's get back to the interview.
So, John, how does the brain know how to make 2,000 muscles or 100 muscles contract?
Yeah, we're talking about muscle fibres here, of course, the actual
Yes,
individual motor units, if you like. Well, part of it's hard wiring. Your gastrocnemius muscle is a big muscle at the back of your calf, or a big muscle in many people's calves. And so that muscle architecturally has been designed, so there is only one nerve fibre speaking to 1,000 to 2,000 muscle fibres. So if your brain decides that you need to run away from a snake, the brain already knows that you need to use your gastrocnemius, so it's sending a flood of signals to it. But
Okay.
and therefore your gastrocnemius contracts and you suddenly fly, literally fly. I remember I had a patient once. He wasn't young, though he was younger than I am now. And so he wasn't young, and he had a bit of a middle-age spread. And he told me he hurt his gastrocnemius muscle sprinting. And I'm looking at this man thinking, why would you sprint? Where are you going to go? You know, you're not built like a sprinter. You're not dressed like a sprinter. And he said, well, he just bought a piece of land, and it was acreage, as we say in Australia, so a fairly big block in the bush.
Yeah.
And as he was enjoying walking through the paddock, he stood on a snake, and he became a sprinter. And unfortunately, because he hadn't sprinted for decades, then the muscle broke down. But thankfully, he was far enough away from the snake. So anyway, so your brain knows, given a situation or given a will, a decision in your mind, what it's got to do. So obviously the snake scenario is a reflex, and your brain automatically knows what to do. You don't have to tell your brain, I need to sprint, get me out of here. It just happens like that, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
But equally, you may choose to be standing listening to a speech, but you don't have to stand to listen to a speech. You could walk on the spot. You could lean from left to right. But if you're choosing to try and stand still for whatever reason, then you've made a willful choice, but then your brain knows what to do with that willful choice. You don't have to tell the brain, I want to stand still. Can you please make my soleus muscle work? You don't have to do that. It just happens automatically. And the soleus muscle, like the gastrocnemius muscle, it's architecturally designed that one nerve fibre, one tiny branch of a bundle of nerves will speak to 180 muscle fibres. So great efficiency, because you don't need many muscle fibres just to keep your centre of gravity where it should be.
So with all the complexities of these muscles, and we're amazed by them, and we know how they communicate to one another now, but couldn't they have evolved where they need to be?
Yeah. So let's get back to what evolution means and what the story of evolution says. And I think it is more like a story than a series of scientific evidence-based statements.
Okay.
So they're saying that we have this big genetic code, which is true. We have DNA, and on the DNA are the letters that make up the language of life, to put it poetically. So there's 4 letters in that alphabet, just like in the computer code there's 2 letters, binary, 0 and 1. And of course in English we have 26 letters, etc. So in the genetic language of life there are 4 letters. And these are spread along this double helix, which just looks like a twisted rope ladder.
Yeah.
And each rung represents 2 letters, and they're in pairs. So it's like half of a rung is 1 letter and half of the other rung is the other letter. So evolution believes that when you have this series of letters, that sometimes when they get copied, of course the cell needs to divide, that sometimes there's a mistake. And so one of those letters will be swapped out for another letter by mistake, and we call that a mutation. And it's true that, fortunately for us, the Language of Life book has some ability to cope with some changes. So you can have mutations that don't seem to cause any problems, depending on where it is in the language of life. Many times, unfortunately, when you have a single letter change, it can be a death knell to that organism, or it can lead to major changes. So when you think about, well, how could 1 letter change at a time create this sort of interconnectedness from a single-celled animal? It's a little bit far-fetched, because the single-celled animal's not thinking, oh, one day I want to be a biped, I want to stand and be like a mat, I want to be like a mat. And a single cell doesn't think that.
Yeah.
All that's happening is that sometimes when it divides, there's a mistake made. And if that mistake creates some advantage, then providing that advantage is big enough, then it might become something that makes that cell have an advantage over other cells. But how is that going to create all of this and all that interconnectedness? There's no point having a mistake in a muscle that makes more muscle if you don't also at the same time have a mistake in the nervous system. That means that there's a nerve talking to that muscle. That means that there's also got to be a mistake in the blood vessel system to make sure that new bit of muscle's got some blood vessels to it. And that's just the beginning of it all. And as we said before, if you do have some sort of mistake that made more muscle, that's not necessarily going to be an advantageous situation. But there are mutations like that.
Okay.
So there is a condition that some people have, which we would call a mutated genetic disease, called myostatin muscle-related hypertrophy. Sounds like a lot of big words.
That's a bit too complicated for me. Can you simplify?
So myostatin's the name of a protein.
Okay.
It's muscle-related, so it's called myostatin muscle-related hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Now, hypertrophy you might see at the gym. Some people go to the gym and they work out and they get bigger muscles.
Well, I wish I could.
Very good. And so they've made their muscles bigger, so they've actually hypertrophied their muscles.
Yeah.
But some people have this condition called myostatin muscle-related muscle hypertrophy. So it will cause some muscles to actually be bigger than if they didn't have that mutation.
But wouldn't that be a good thing? A little bit stronger?
Unfortunately, these hypertrophies can sometimes get in the way. And
How so?
This mutation certainly makes more muscle mass grow. In fact, they can have twice as much muscle mass throughout their body as somebody who doesn't have this mutation. But the problem is that it's not a whole system change.
Yeah.
And the system we've got is interrelated. So this one mutation means that they have a decrease in the density of blood vessels, fine blood vessels we call capillaries. So that's not a good thing when you've got increased muscle mass. They have extra fibrosis and a change in the structure of their tendons. So it actually leads to more injuries and compromises.
Instead of strength.
Instead of the strength. So if you want to have bigger muscles, if you go to a gym, your body will respond not just by making bigger muscles, but your tendons will get stronger because muscles are joined to bone by tendons, and your nervous system is attuned to the slow changes being happened. With this disease, the whole system's not changing at the same time, at the same rate, is it? You're getting extra muscle growth, but unfortunately you're not getting the increase in capillaries, and you're getting fibrotic changes elsewhere. So it actually causes compromises. So that's an example where, yes, there are mutations that will cause you to grow more muscle mass, but overall they don't increase your functional abilities.
If you're enjoying this interview so far, you might be interested to know that we also produce the world's most widely read magazine on the creation-evolution debate, Creation Magazine. It's packed with beautifully illustrated articles showing how real science supports the Bible. It's designed for the whole family and is a great tool for strengthening your faith. Sign up now to receive 4 issues per year. Follow the link in the description.
So, John, even with these mutations not always being beneficial, can't some mutations or evolution create muscles in other places that could be beneficial?
Well, certainly, unfortunately, there are times when people have mutations that result in muscles growing where we don't want them to be. So just like some women, when they have a baby, it grows up in the womb, and we talk about it doesn't grow up in the womb, it grows up somewhere else. We call it ectopic pregnancy. So that word ectopic means it's something where it's some part of a person's body, or in this case a baby, not in the right place. So there is a condition, a mutation, that results in ectopic muscle formation. It's called simply PIK3CA. So just like...
complicated.
A bit complicated. Well, some people know the names of cars like that. They know the Model T Ford and they know the Leyland P76 from many decades ago. Geneticists and anatomists, we know the names of a lot of things just like everybody else does. This our bread and butter, if you like, or a geneticist's bread and butter.
And so these ectopic muscles are just muscles that grow where they're not supposed to be.
Yeah, that's right. Ectopic muscles, like an ectopic pregnancy. And so this mutation, it actually stands for phosphatidyl inositol 3 kinase catalytic subunit alpha. That's why everyone calls it PIK3CA. So when this mutation happens, you've suddenly got a scenario where you've got muscles growing where they shouldn't be growing.
Yeah.
one patient I was reading about, because it's not a common disease, but it is found in cancer, in a number of cancers, conditions that cause cancer. One patient had in their hand 4 ectopic muscles, and that causes problems because they're not where they should be. It causes problems functionally because there's only a certain amount of space.
Yeah.
And it also causes a problem aesthetically, the way people look. You wouldn't want to have big bulging muscles where nobody else has big bulging muscles. Another patient had 13 ectopic muscles, so muscles not where they belong. And these mutations happen very early on when a baby is being formed in a mother's womb. But once again, notice that these people don't go on to go to the Olympics.
No.
Because these muscles aren't the ones that are designed to be part of our system. So it's almost evidence against evolution. When we do see mutations that create muscles where they shouldn't be, we never see people saying, I'm so glad I got this new muscle. Generally, it involves surgery to get rid of these muscles that become problematic.
So ectopic muscles generally produce problems.
Yes, that's right. Because they're not where they were designed to be. It's a bit like having a car and having an extra piston, but the car was never designed to have more than 4 in the first place. How's it going to interrelate with all the other systems? Where are you going to put it under the hood? Chances are if you're going to shove another piston there, something else is going to rub against it and it'll be a problem. Yeah.
I see. And does that problem with the ectopic muscles generally cause pain?
Oh, it can cause pain, yeah. Certainly, because when we have, well, actually now we're going to have to talk about another set of conditions. There is another condition. It's actually called accessory muscles. And this highlights a point to do with your question.
Okay.
It highlights this point that when you have mutations that cause changes that we weren't designed to have, they're not advantageous. They're often problems.
Yeah.
So we talked about ectopic muscles, so muscles growing where they shouldn't be because of a mutation in a gene that's often associated with cancers. So already there are alarm bells forming. And we talked about how surgery is often needed to correct the ensuing problems. But there are times when people get accessory muscles. Not much is fully understood about why some people have it, how much it's genetic, how much it's caused by other factors. But it's like, imagine you got your biceps muscle here. It's called biceps because it's got 2 heads. Bi as in bicycle, 2 wheels. Sept as in cephalic, your head. Some people actually have a 3rd slip of the bicep muscle.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to, these accessory muscles don't seem to confer much advantage in the big scheme of things. Typically what they do is cause problems.
Even though they're in the right place?
Yeah, they're near the right place, but it's extra mass.
Okay. But
So
what does that
What does that
cause?
do? Yeah. So sometimes when muscles are getting too big, in a case like ectopic muscles, they can actually squeeze other structures that shouldn't be squeezed that much. So you can get them squeezing, for instance, a nerve. So the muscle's too big for where it should be, and there's a nerve that's passing between the muscle and a bone. If that muscle's too big, then that nerve's going to get damaged, and that's the heart of what we could call nerve compression syndromes. Sometimes it's a nerve and a tendon and an artery are all going through one tunnel. Now, if there's extra tendon mass in that tunnel, then one of those other vessels, the nerve or the artery, are going to get compromised, and that'll cause a problem. So accessory muscles are usually found when people are having surgery to fix other problems. In other words, they typically don't cause a problem, but sometimes they do cause problems, therefore people need surgery to rectify it.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're an interesting anomaly. But once again, they're not the sort of change that's going to turn a hand into a wing. All it's doing is duplicating a set of instructions. This is one simple way of understanding it, to an instruction set you've already got it there. Whereas if you want to turn a hand into a wing or a wing into a hand or a nose into a beak, you need whole new chapters, don't you, of information. That's all got to relate to all the other chapters. And so these changes aren't indicative of any evolutionary advantage. They just show us that mutations, although many of them are neutral in the sense that they don't seem to cause big problems or noticeable changes, some of them do. In fact, there's 500 disease-associated mutations just with the nervous and muscular system. So I hope that helps people see that for a spine like this to evolve from something that looked totally different, you're going to have needed totally different instruction manuals. You can't just tweak one instruction manual a few letters at a time, because you need whole new information sets of instruction to make a spine.
So you've spoken a little bit about the complexities of the spine and how you don't think it's evolved, about the different muscle groups, including ectopic muscles and accessory muscles, and how inconvenient they can be sometimes and the problems associated with them. But excuse my ignorance, what are ligaments? Are they not just another muscle group?
Good question. So muscles join onto bone through a structure called a tendon. So they literally start off as that nice red piece of meat that you eat on your dinner table. That's all muscle. And then they morph. They gradually change into a totally different structure called a tendon to then eventually join onto a bone. Ligaments are often thought of as structures that join one bit of bone, one bone to another bone. Now, some ligaments actually help hold soft tissues in place. So that's not, so in other words, ligaments don't always join bone to bone. And so there are some exceptions like that. But in general, especially with the spine, we're looking at the normal everyday ligaments that join bone to bone. There's about 900 different ligaments in the human body.
Wow.
Yeah. And they are quite complicated.
So they're just like little ropes that have tied it all together.
Yeah, yes. I'm afraid many physios, and I've been to blame at this stage in my life, earlier years, have actually used that analogy. Think of them as ropes that just join bone to bone, but their complexity is enormous. So for a start, they have a certain amount of elastin in them. So let me explain this. So we're talking about there's 900 different ligaments.
Yep.
Actually, can I talk about this with the spine? So this here, facing you, that would be obviously where all your organs are. This is the front of the person. And this spiny bit back here we talked about, that's the back of the person. Yep. So there's a ligament that runs all the way down the front of all of these, the anterior surface, and that's called the anterior longitudinal ligament.
And that's one ligament?
Yeah, though some of it stretches just between one segment and 2 or 3 or 4 segments down below.
Okay.
But we call it all one ligament, even though it's lots of smaller sections altogether. And it's quite robust, that ligament. Then you've got a ligament at the back. Now, I don't know whether you can tell, but this here represents like a cylinder with a waist. And that goes all the way around to the other side. But you've got this extra bit of bone that sticks out, haven't you?
Yeah.
It looks like it's got a leg on that side to join the extra section of bone. And the same here, you can see there's your cylinder and there's a little leg, we call them pedicles, to create this, to mount this other section of that same bone. And I think this is a good time to actually pause. This is just one solid bone. So this incredibly awkward looking shape where you've got this round cylinder, you got this little feet here, you got this spinous process there, you got this superior articular process there, the inferior articular process there, you got a nerve going through the intervertebral foramina. Because, of course, thankfully, there's a gap created by the structure of the bone. That's just one bone.
Yeah.
So the software instructions that we have don't just create bone tissue. The software instructions have to create the shape or be involved in the shape of the bone. And you think about how this lumbar bone here, its shape with that big rectangle there is quite different to the shape up at the neck, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So once again, it shows that the genetic book of life, that language of life, is a very big book. It's actually 3,200 million letters long. So we've got this ligament in the spine that goes all the way on this front surface. Then at the back, we can't pull this one apart, unfortunately, of the back of that cylinder, there's a posterior longitudinal ligament. And that also supports the tissue. Some ligaments need to be really rigid, and some ligaments we want them to be a bit elastic. So some ligaments have about, just like when you buy a shirt, you might read how much elastin is in the fabric of the shirt, depending on what you want the shirt to do, whether you want it to hug your body or not, whether you want it to drape in a certain fashion, you choose the amount of elasticity. So our design that we have in our body dictates that some ligaments have only 7% elastin, whereas some of them, one we call the ligamentum flavum, which is deep in, it'll be very hard to show on the camera. I'll have to really split this apart. Need some surgical equipment to do so. And so it has 20% elastin. So elastic means, of course, that when you stretch it, it'll bounce back to its original length. So that's a lot of elastin. And that's already introducing complexity. It's no longer like a rigid rope, is it?
No, it's not. It is quite complicated. But what is the benefit of having it so elastic or not so?
Well, the benefit is that sometimes we want these ligaments to give a little, and sometimes we want them to be quite rigid. So the benefit has to fit into the whole design of the system. Just like you might want a rigid bonnet, but you want a soft chair to sit on in your car. And this all helps people, I hope, to see that this is a really complex integrated system. To try and make this system from something that was once totally different, like just a tube, is unfathomable, isn't it? So these ligaments, though, to have that degree of elastin, they need genes to control the amount of elastin in them. Because elastin actually comes from a molecule, mostly comes from a molecule we call Fibrillin-1. So
what is fibrillin?
Fibrillin's a smallish sort of a molecule that connects to itself and other proteins to actually help make what we call elastic fibres, elastin. And all that process has to be controlled by genes. So once again, it's all part of the instruction set. Now, these genes we talked about are literally like language instructions. Sometimes those genes can have trouble. So the gene for making this elastic property, this Fibrillin-1, this elastic molecule, it's quite a large gene. It's got about 11,600 base pairs, so 11,600 rungs in the ladder, just for controlling the elasticity of this making this molecule, this elastic molecule.
And so you don't believe that it could have evolved by itself?
Not 11,600 base pairs. So it's a lot of letters that all have to be in the right arrangement at the right time to create an end product that then has to be folded and shaped in the right way for it to be functional. This fibrillin gene, so it's 11,600 base pairs long. It's creating a protein. I said it's a bit small. Small is relative, isn't it? Am I short? Well, it probably depends on whom I'm standing beside. When I stand beside some people, I don't see myself as short. This protein is actually over 2,870 amino acids long. So think of amino acids as the building blocks of a protein. We all want protein to help make muscle and to do all sorts of other things. So it's not a small protein, but it's equally not a big one like titin. Now, when that gene makes a mistake, it can sometimes be quite disastrous. What's fascinating is that there are 1,300 mistakes that we know of in this gene, and they all cause a problem.
What is it?
1,300 different letter mistakes that generally cause the same problem we call Marfan syndrome.
And sorry, but what is Marfan's?
I'm not sure where the word Marfan's come from, but I'm pretty sure it's a discoverer. Is a name of a series of problems that people will have, all due to mutations in this one gene. And what I find amazing is 1,300 different letter changes all result in a problem.
And what is it?
Well, the problem is that the amount of elastin is not what it should be in these, and this elastin is not just used to make ligaments. This elastin is linked to what we call growth factors, things that help other things to grow. So you can appreciate, okay, if there's a mutation that changes elastin, well, maybe that's going to be bad because it changes the amount of elasticity. But then when you realise, oh no, this molecule actually affects growth factors, you can realise, wow, this is going to have a lot of other problems. So people with Marfan's condition not only have problems with flexibility, but they often have cardiovascular problems, so things wrong with their heart and their blood vessels. They often have lung problems, and many of them will have a shortness of life due to one big artery failing. So that shows you once again the interconnectedness of this book of life that we have, and to think that a change one letter at a time can make such an elegant interrelated system is a bit foolish, in my opinion, based on the evidence of how everything's so tightly related.
And so back to the ligaments. Sorry, I don't mean to detract from you, but before you said that all the muscles are controlled by the nerve endings, are ligaments controlled in a similar fashion?
Oh, very good question. No, they are used by nerves, and they've got very complex signalling system.
Yeah.
So obviously when your muscle stretches, like let's imagine there's a muscle between this one and this one. In fact, there is. Yep. When it stretches, you probably want to know that. Just like you want to know when the muscle's working. You want to know if you're picking up a heavy load, you probably there's a certain satisfaction in knowing which muscles are working when you're lifting a big load. You can sense, oh, that's my biceps. I think there's actually a reason for being able to sense your biceps working hard, because sooner or later you'll work it too hard and it'll rupture. So your body does signal when your muscles are working and when they're stretching. Everyone knows that feeling of stretch when you stretch a muscle, which isn't just stretching muscle, it's stretching ligaments, of course. Now, ligaments, you want to know what's happening in them, but you want to know that subconsciously. Just like you want to subconsciously know what your heart rate is. You don't want to think about, I need to make my heart rate go faster, or I need to think about how fast my heart is going.
No, I just want it to work.
You just want it to work. So you want that knowledge of heart rate to be in the back of your brain, so to speak, metaphorically, and your brain be making adjustments for the fact that it needs to go faster or slower. Yeah. So that sort of subconscious level. So these ligaments, they have two ways of signaling to your brain about what's happening in their structure. Two different ways.
And what are they?
Well, one is a similar concept to what a lot of people learn. So when you touch something, you run your finger across the surface, you can feel fine ridges, can't you? Yeah. In this surface, because the tablecloth, it's got some ridges in it. So you have sensors in your fingertips that are designed, and I would say designed by God. In fact, I'd even say designed by Jesus Christ, because in the Bible it talks about him as the designer, that pick up the sense of touch, fine touch. Just like you have sensors in your body that pick up when a stimulus is potentially dangerous or is dangerous, and that makes you feel pain. Yeah. So there are sensors in our body that feel stretch, and we feel vibration or feel a certain amount of pressure. We call them mechanoreceptors, as opposed to thermal receptors, ones that sense whether the surface you're going to put your hand on is hot or cold. So these receptors are all part of the integrated system. But we have these ligaments, and they have receptors. They're called Paxinian corpuscles and Ruffini corpuscles that speak to the brain about things like the mechanics of it, the stretch of it. And that's really important, because you want to know, oh, gee, my ligaments are really working hard because I'm really stretching it, so maybe I need to bring in some muscles to take off the stretch. And that'll often be a subconscious thought, won't it? I had hoped that by seeing the interrelatedness of all these structures on a human spine, and knowing that none of this happens just due to chemistry. We talked about the shape of one of these bones, that needed to be controlled by a set of instructions in your genes. Just like the material that makes up a ligament, that needs to be controlled by a set of instructions in your genes. So these set of instructions are like any other set of instructions. They need to have come from a source of intelligence. No one ever sees sets of instruction manuals that have just happened by chance. No one believes, for instance, that if you had all 26 letters of the alphabet and you had 1 million letters of each letter, 1 million letters of the letter A and the 1 million letters of the letter B, that no matter how many times that you juggled them and threw them up in the air and used chance, because that's all you got, especially in the first living organism, that's going to come up with an instruction manual. I think a lot of people struggle with appreciating that this is so designed. One, because they don't know what's under the hood. In other words, what's under our skin. Many of my patients, simply because they might be extremely bright electrical physicists, they've just never been taught about anatomy. I hope that I've helped people see that this is as complex as any machine on earth, and especially the instruction manual that controls this level of complexity. And we've talked about how to have an instruction manual, that needs to come from an intelligent source, an intelligent mind. Instruction manuals don't just come about by random chance. Everyone knows that even a simple statement like "I love you," that statement is a piece of information. And any piece of information we know typically or always comes from an intelligent mind. You don't ever walk along the beach and one day see the wind and the waves having accidentally written in the sand the letters and the words "I love you." You might see the wind and the waves perhaps creating some shape that might look like an L or some shape that might look like a V. But as soon as you saw in the sand "I love you," you know that you are looking at information. It's just part of your understanding of what information is. And you'll realise that that had to be written by somebody with an intelligent mind. This instruction manual we're talking about is much bigger than just 3 words, "I love you." It's 3,200 billion letters long. And we've talked about how when you tinker with this through accidental mutations, sometimes you can get away with it, but sometimes those changes will interfere with the whole system, not just the spine. Like I mentioned with Marfan syndrome, it affects even their blood vessels. Jesus Christ, we believe, as people who love Jesus, we believe that he created the world perfect. So we're not surprised when we see perfection in systems like the spine of a vertebrate animal. That's what we would just expect an intelligent designer who's infinitely knowledgeable to be able to do in the wink of an eye. Certainly, since we were created perfectly, since then there has been a running down of our systems, especially our genetic system. And this, Christians believe, is due to the curse. Adam and Eve sinned, and as a result of that sin, God punished the world. And that punishment results in many things, including the decaying of our genomes. So mutations become more and more prevalent over time with each generation. And we see that, unfortunately, in some individuals having these conditions that we've talked about here during this interview, where sometimes surgery is needed to correct them, but unfortunately sometimes there is no surgical option available. So I hope that helps you see why I bring Jesus Christ into a conversation about the complexity and the design of the spine. I love him. I know his reality in my life. I can't prove that to you, but I hope that you can start to see that there's plenty of evidence, not proof if you like, but evidence that there was an intelligent designer who put all this together, and that designer is actually Jesus.
So, John, you got some amazing passion and an immense amount of knowledge about the complexity of the design that you believe in. Where could other people go who are interested in knowing more?
Well, certainly I think Creation Ministries International's website, creation.com, is a really good first port of call. But this magazine, Creation Magazine, which has been going for decades now, I remember it when it was even not so glossy and coloured from so long ago. It's a great resource as well. I noticed the latest issue actually has a piece about the Bajau people. Bajau are a group of people, I guess once upon a time we were called tribal people, we now call them ethnic groups in Malaysia. And when I was doing malaria research in Malaysia, I met Bajaus. I met a whole bunch of interesting ethnic groups there. So I was fascinated to see the latest Creation magazine, not this one, but the one after it, has actually got an article about Bajau people and how they can free dive to 70 metres.
Wow.
And even when I was with those people in Malaysia, I didn't know they could free dive to 70 metres. I don't think anybody else did. He did either. What I'm saying is that this magazine really makes it an entertaining investigation to see what evidence there is that there is a designer, God, that has put this world together. And so it provides evidence for having a love for Jesus Christ as someone who's real and can intervene in our lives and make us totally new creatures.
And if you're interested in the Creation magazine, just click the link below. Thanks, Jonathan.
You're very welcome, Matt. My pleasure.